Institute. Just started the recording, so I'll start again. Honey, bienvenue, welcome. I'm Dr. Lisa Porter, and I'm the Executive Director of WeSpark Health Institute. I'm thrilled to welcome our guest speaker here today, Dr. Kenneth Drouillard. Before we begin, it's important to recognize that while we are all virtually on land that perhaps has a different story, here in Windsor, Essex, we are lucky to reside on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. And while their story is not mine to tell, I'm learning that throughout history, the different nations within the Three Fires not only celebrated their differences, but they relied on them. They established common language and laws and worked together to be collectively stronger. They were quite literally one of the first examples of a successful collaboration. Our nation is very slowly acknowledging the richness, importance, and tragedy of the history that's buried in these lands. And I'm becoming increasingly aware that we not only have a lot to learn about the First Nations people, but we have a lot to learn from them. That not only involves listening and learning, but being vocal and putting pen to paper to let the government know that we support reconciliation. And so today I'm coming to you from WeSpark Health Institute. And for those who don't know about WeSpark, we are an organization that supports health, research strengths, expertise, and infrastructure from across Windsor, Essex, by establishing research pipelines, supporting collaboration, and providing research funds and tools to address pressing health issues. We advance discovery, innovation, and technology and support training and promote excellence among our health professionals. Our goal is to enhance the health, well-being, and care of people in our region through knowledge translation and research excellence. And I invite you to visit our website at www.wesparkhealth.com or .ca. So just as an introduction, Dr. Kenneth Drouillard is a professor at the University of Windsor's School of the Environment and a researcher affiliated with the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research, or GLEAR, and WeSpark Health Institute. Ken joined the University of Windsor in 2002 by completing his BSc here at the University of Windsor, followed by an MSc at the University of Manitoba and his PhD at Trent University. Ken co-directs the GLEAR Organic Analytical and Nutrient Laboratory, an internationally accredited laboratory used by the Ministry of the Environment, Environment and Climate Change Canada, the City of Windsor, the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and many others. His understanding of quality and control procedures, environmental and laboratory auditing, and using various analytical technologies in water and air quality research allowed him to pivot his talents into mask-related research during COVID pandemic with the help of WeSpark's call for the COVID-related projects. Ken has demonstrated his commitment to Windsor Essex community by his local outreach activities, including knowledge translation of the benefits and risks of eating Great Lakes fish, co-op published in the Windsor Star, uncovering the risks of lead exposure in Windsor Essex in children from drinking fountains in schools. I would imagine from the University of Windsor's drinking fountains as well, and regionally by facilitating incorporation of Indigenous perspectives into provincial fish advisory programs through his work with the Mohawk Council of Ogwisawi. And in the, and I pronounced that wrong, in the St. Lawrence River in partnership with the International Joint Commission. Ken has received the, for all of these things and much more that I can't even cover in this introduction, Ken has received the Essex Region Conservation Authority's Conservation Achievement Award this year for his decades of research in helping to restore the Detroit River through his involvement with the Detroit River Canadian Cleanup Committee. He currently has 149 publications, 2 book chapters covering national and international research through the Great Lakes, China, Caribbean, CARICOM nations, and Dubai. And he currently holds funding through 2 NSERC projects, an International Joint Commission, and the Ontario Ministry of Environment and Environment Climate Change Canada. The work he's going to be presenting today is the output from a WeSpark grant, and he's currently undergoing peer review in scientific literature, and I hope it's his 150th publication. That would be exciting. So the title of his talk today is Medical versus 2-ply Cotton Masks, a Research Update. And I'm going to invite Ken to share his presentation on the screen.
All right, thank you, Lisa, and I will do that right now. hopefully that's coming through. And almost always the title you put on your slide doesn't always match what your chair or moderator tends to discuss it. So slightly longer title, probably less concise than what Lisa had indicated. And I really want to take this time to sort of acknowledge really a large number of researchers, and some of these are co-authors onto the +1 paper. Others are certainly vital participants in this whole research enterprise on 2-ply masks. And you know, it was a great pleasure to be part of this truly interdisciplinary exercise. As an environmental scientist, I consider myself used to multidisciplinary research, but I think here we transcended that into a true interdisciplinary research with contributions from all levels of trainees, from undergrads to grads to technicians to profs, to 3 institutions, University of Windsor, St. Clair College, and McMaster University, and a whole host of industry people and really highly motivated individuals throughout these institutions. So thank you for your contributions as part of this. So as Lisa indicated, we want to certainly acknowledge we're occupying on campus the traditional territory of the 3 nations, 3 Fires Confederacy of First Nations, the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. And while our talk is focused on textiles and cloth, I thought it would be fun to take some appreciation for the Indigenous innovations in textile designs and their contributions in things such as our quilting community and the art that's displayed that has that unique perspective to these types of designs. Again, and I couldn't say it much better than what Lisa had indicated about this spirit of collaboration and trying to move forward. We all just came back from our first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation last week, and hopefully we will build on those those days in future commemorations of this important event. So I'm going to kind of launch off my talk. It's going to end up being a little bit more technical as we go through about some of the things that we did, and then try to bring it back to the perspective of what the outcomes are in terms of how we can position our understanding of the performance of cloth masks relative to medical masks. But before I did that, I wanted to give a little bit of context and background about how mask science kind of evolved and how we got to the point of where we are today, and why is it in 2020 we have people thinking about cloth mask research in a serious and very productive way, whereas for the most part we thought we had solved all these issues in the 1970s. So really the history of mask research has its roots in the early 1900s. And these were basically the founding principles of basically septic sanitary techniques in operating room theater. And it was started to be recognized in the early 1900s about the value of masks, which at the time were essentially gauze, cotton gauze masks that were worn by surgeons, and it was recognized that this helped protect the patients that are undergoing surgery against infections, and in recognition, of course, that it was the surgeons themselves that were potentially contributing to that infectious exposure. So this gained a lot of inquiry and study demonstrating proof of concept of masks in an operating theater. It actually became established in the 1930s as part of sanitary practices in surgical interventions. The 1950s was sort of a landmark in mask surgery, surgical mask design, where it became, again, part and parcel of standard practice in the health education realm. It wasn't until the 1960s that we started to marry the concept of hydrophobic face fabrics. These are types of fabrics not typical of cottons or silks or natural fabrics, which we call hydrophilic, or they tend to absorb water. Hydrophobic fabrics are things that repel water or water resistant and are usually classified as or typical of synthetic fabrics like polyesters and some of the now non-woven polyester-based materials, plastic-based materials. Those started to be incorporated because of, not for the infectious agent perspective, but to protect the surgeons. So we started off with masks as protecting the patient from the surgeon's breath. And then the incorporation of hydrophobic material was to protect the surgeon, not so much from infectious agents, but from blood splatter and droplets generated when they were working on patients. So protection from blood-borne pathogens. And that was sort of the emphasis. And then it was in the 1970s that sort of became, standard practice in what we refer to as a procedural or a surgical style mask that incorporated as dental masks in other forms. The 1970s saw the invention by 3M of now the gold standard N95 respirator, which is a form-fitted mask. Those N95 respirators were designed for industrial hygiene, really to protect workers against metal filings and small particles generated in the workplace. But they were able to show that a combination of the materials used that had electric properties, so their charge distribution helped to remove really small, tiny-sized particles, plus this form-fitting nature of the mask really improved its performance. I think it would come to a surprise. It wasn't really until the late about 1998 where the World Health Organization started to recommend N95s for healthcare workers exposed to infectious agents. So basically, that's where we were at. And then before we get a little bit further into that kind of evolution of mask science, I want to sort of clarify some definitions that are sort of floating around in our contrast between cloth masks versus medical masks. So let's first start off with the PPE, or protective personal equipment. And really, PPE, that term is assigned only to certified masks used to basically to help prevent occupational exposures in one form or another. So with respect to masks, we refer typically to medical masks, and these can have many names and flavors: surgical masks, isolation, dental masks, procedural masks, and so forth. Again, they're designed uniformly as part of their certification by ASTM standards, that they have hydrophobic face fabrics, that they have a minimum filtration capacity for bacterial-sized particles, typically 95% filtration efficiency. And these are often used within healthcare environments that are a low-risk infectious disease exposure event. These are considered to be single-use disposable items. And again, they are certified items. In order to be labeled as a medical mask, they have to be constructed of certain types of materials and undergo basically testing on a standard basis. Similarly, the N95 respirators are a distinct class of PPE, and then you also have full faceplate respirators that are another class. But these are close-fitting masks, whereas surgical masks are sort of the looser drape that fit around the face. They're meant specifically to block small aerosols in the 0.1 to 1 micron size range. The reason why they use N95 in the name is that 95 represents the filtration capability of that material. You can also have N99 designated respirators as well, which will filter out 99% of the particles. Again, like medical masks, these are single-use disposable items, and they are undergo certification in Canada by the Canada Standards Association, in the US by NIOSH, and their equivalent international bodies do this certification. These things, both the N95s and medical masks have to pass a breathability test called the pressure drop requirement. And one other thing that's really important to note is that an N95 mask is not considered a certified mask use unless the individual who's wearing it has undergone fit testing. So, and fit testing is part of the procedures that we'll be using in this particular study. But what that means is you went in, you basically had facial measurements, facial size measurements, taken so that they can fit you to the correct size of mask for your facial characteristics. They actually test you with a fit testing apparatus where they basically add small sodium chloride aerosol particles into the room. They put a probe through the mask so they can measure the interior particle concentration against the exterior particle concentration. And in order to pass that test, you have to be able to don the mask yourself without assistance from anyone else, and then achieve a fit factor of more than 30, indicating the proficiency of that fit. So we talked about PPE, and now we move on to cloth masks. And again, cloth masks are not sanctioned for use in a workplace environment for the protection of occupational health that requires mask as part of its protective gear. So we don't really consider them PPE per se. And mostly this is because they lack standardization and the certification required to adopt it as official PPE. Now, I should note that there has been movement. In February of this year. ASDM has published a standard, F3502-21, which is intended for use for commercial cloth masks that are produced. And basically, this standard describes what's required and how to test the components and what can be used in labeling regarding mask efficiency. And you will notice that the requirements are quite a bit lower than surgical masks. So in the case of submicron particle filtration efficiency, the surgical mask was at 95%. Commercial cloth masks, that standard is a pretty low bar at less than or greater than 20%, and a fairly high pressure drop range of 147 pascals compared to sort of the acceptable range for an N95 mask of 60 pascals. So that gives a lot of leeway for constructing masks, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee high degree of quality or efficient performance. The standard isn't required, but there are some Canadian companies that are producing cloth masks that indicate that they're adhering to these standards. So if you see a cloth mask that actually has a label concerning its use, intended use, then it probably adheres to that standard. Okay, so this begs the question. I try to introduce the fact that we've got PPE, and then we've got cloth masks that are not PPE, and then why is it that we recommend fabric masks for public use, but not necessarily healthcare use? Why is this dual standard? And really it just comes down to intended use patterns and overall risk. So public are encouraged to apply a whole set of multivariate approaches to safety protocols involving reducing their own risk to COVID exposures. And this is something that professionals, particularly healthcare workers, can't they can't, invoke all of these safety precautions. They have to breach physical distancing. They are exposed to aspirations, oral aspirations, and in close contacts. They are exposed to individuals that have documented positive cases. So they need to level up their degree of protection. And I think that's a fair assessment. But we as public adopters of cloth mask technology always have to sort of consider that this mask is not a single bullet solution. The mask works in conjunction with all of these other measures that we've become familiarized over this last 18 months. So we use them with physical distancing, building and room capacity limits, and even hopefully enhanced ventilation. So I'm sure many of us are familiar with the portable ventilators, HEPA filters being put in our school classrooms, frequent hand hygiene, COVID testing, contact tracing, and self-isolation requirements, and of course, this brand new tool available early this year of vaccination. Again, what happened early in the pandemic? There's been changes in the communication by components such as Health Canada, World Health Organization, and US CDC about should the public mask or not mask. And this comes into the context of really early in those pandemic days. And I know for all of us, 18 months seems like a decade ago. But if you recall, there were grave fears at that time about shortages of PPE to our healthcare workers and our inability to compete with this global demand to supply PPE both to the public and to healthcare. So that was the context of some of the earlier decisions for not recommending masks, plus not having a full understanding of the aerosolized nature of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that generates COVID-19. But we can also sort of think about this transition of a reliance on disposable, PPE, really intended and developed for use in a healthcare environment. And they do have good, strong benefits in terms of their performance, but cloth masks have a lot of good attributes that can be placed onto the table. And maybe some of these good attributes can offset their somewhat lower performance. So again, the first and foremost is availability. The fact that you can make a cloth mask from local materials, and I mean really local. Most of us can just walk to our closet and find a suitable t-shirt that we can generate a cotton mask from. They're robust. That makes them very robust to supply interruptions. Remember the toilet paper shortage days? Well, that still may happen, or at least the pandemic in its early onset demonstrated just how fragile our global industry sector and global trade system can be to interruptions that very quickly generate supply shortages. There's also the big sustainability. For one, for those with a lower income status, it could be expensive buying a surgical mask and basically disposing it after each use, which is in keeping. Surgical masks do not retain their effectiveness, especially if you wash them with detergents, because that basically breaks apart their electric properties and they become quickly degrade in their performance. So the ability to reuse and wash and disinfect cotton masks with normal laundering cycles, to use heat and ironing as part of that disinfection strategy makes it a sustainable option. Buy one cloth mask, maybe 5 cloth masks, but you wear those and rotate them, and that is the totality of your economic investment. And then finally, how can I avoid it as a environmental scientist to sort of say less waste is a good thing, particularly given our now societal recognition of plastics in our environment, and surgical masks is one source of those plastics these days. The last thing is this aspect of consumer choice, which I think we often undervalue within the mask literature. So, it might not be that only one mask design works for everybody and different people. This is one of the things that we engaged as part of our WeSpark grant, was doing public surveys of mask users. And we found, of course, that many people landed on the right mask for them, and that wasn't in common across all of our respondents. So different people can find different masks that best work for them. Some masks will be more comfortable. Some masks will be made out of non-allergenic materials. Some masks may have patterns that are culturally appropriate, and others that basically we find have suitable aesthetics. And we can scoff at, aesthetic attributes of a mask, but if it increases conformance and mask usage, those are good attributes. So we kind of see a lot of mask research, in our timeline. It kind of moved up and then it stalled in the 1970s. And really, cloth mask research per se really stalled after the 1970s. And part and parcel was the fact that there's been so much of an achievement of design, materials, formalization, the certification process, and then adoption of masks formally within healthcare recommendations. And the thought is we made so much progress, industry is going to continue to supply us with all the PPE we anticipate with medical needs. There have been a lot of research through the 1990s, taking us through various, we'll call them close calls, but also looking at, influenza, flu season case studies, and demonstrating how good masks were, whether they were surgical masks or N95, at reducing infections across groups using the mask versus not using the mask. We had, of course, SARS and MERS, which were coronavirus relatives. H1N1 was another case. All of these provided really strong demonstrated case studies showing the benefits that mask usage was particularly effective in protecting healthcare workers. There were some good RCTs that demonstrated just how well mask usage could help caregivers in the home caring for infected individuals, how that helped reduce infectivities. And again, SARS, there have been a number of papers really comparing just how important having healthcare workers routinely use masks decrease their infection risk. Interestingly, not a lot of strong evidence to indicate a superiority of N95 respirators over surgical masks, but that's a sort of another kind of twisty-turny path we can go down to in another lecture. There were a really small number of what we'll call pioneer cloth maskers, and these are sort of modern cloth mask researchers who did acknowledge that, wait, maybe during an extended pandemic, the the COVID-19 didn't occur at that point in time, but we'll call these foreshadowing researchers. They kind of laid the groundwork, and they produced a bunch of important papers with this understanding that it might be possible that maybe we won't be able to get certified PPE, that we might have to make emergency masks out of materials that are locally at hand. And they basically started to adopt the type of mask testing literature formalized in PPE to basically more common commercial fabrics and materials. So a couple of them are highlighted here, and I really want to pay some respect to Vandersand and Davies et al. Papers that really were the sort of seeds for some of the studies that we did moving forward. After the pandemic, of course, there was an explosion of interest in mask mandates. This is the first time we had global mask mandates at the scale that they were put under. And within 18 months, before we had 30-year period where there might be 18 papers, within 18 months, there was more than 40 published papers on mask material science, fit testing, and source transmission. So if we get into the sort of the subfields of mask testing research, we can kind of break this down into 4 components, the first 3 on this slide, the 4th on the next slide coming up. But one of them is just the material characterization. So in material characterization, they might look at the actual filtration performance. So this is not on a mask, this is just a swath of material that they subject to aerosols of different particles, and they figure out what fraction of those particles are retained by the material. It includes pressure drop tests to uncover and indicate the breathability of the material. And these tests in material characterizations, they're used to sort of try and pre-select what would be good materials to construct the mask out of. The other 2 are more functional components. They're tests that are done on masks that have already been constructed. So fit testing, fitted filtration efficiencies and fit testing. These come from the perspective of the user protective value of a mask. And they basically ask, what is the reduction in particle concentration outside the mask compared to the interior of the mask environment? It's the same process that we use for fit testing the N95 respirator, which I talked to you about earlier. And then there's a mask function for source transmission control. And these take the opposite approach. It's basically how much protection does the mask afford those around the people who are surrounding the mask wearer, as opposed to how much protection it affords the mask wearer themselves. So this is actually a brand new subfield in the whole area, generated from the pandemic, where they're using, optical laser-based counting systems to basically detect the cloud of aerosols and droplets that are formed after you're breathing, coughing, sneezing, and doing this with and without masks of different designs. So been a whole series of papers generated on this technique in the last year. And of course, the last is the epidemiological and population modeling type of research. So these are come in 2 flavors. One is the time order contrast, where you might compare mask use and infectiousness, pre and post infectious disease system or across pandemic waves. So this type of modeling exercise has been published in papers such as Zhang and Li et al., demonstrating that if you compared countries and states which had a significant high level of mask usage during the initial stages of the infection, that helped reduce the rate of infectious spread. And then, of course, the gold standard in epidemiology is the application of randomized control trial studies. These are manipulation studies where you have certain groups subject to a specific treatment and intervention, in this case, mask usage versus non-mask usage. So those interventions are not present in the controls. And then they require a lot of matching of the population demographics spatially, where they're located, and across gender and sex, and across age categories, just to ensure that there is similarity between the 2 populations being contrasted. These, of course, have a lot of ethical issues that one has to overcome. We all want the gold standard, but we have to remember there's complications. We're working with real disease incidence rates in these trials, and it makes the ethics about the non-intervention, particularly when it works, a little bit dubious. They also tend to require a very large number of participants. And of course, we've had our first cloth mask RCT. It's in a pre-published mode right now by Avalook et al. And I do have a few words to say about that study at the end of this talk. So when we came to start to formulate where is mass science, well, first of all, as somebody outside of this field, I had to catch myself up into what math science was and what literature was available. But it became apparent that there were a number of data gaps. So even today, there are still data gaps that I think are worth mentioning. So, now we have this growing and cumulative database of characterized materials for filtration and breathability. But if we really carefully look at these studies, oftentimes many of the characterization studies can't be directly compared because they use different methodologies. They challenge their fabrics with different types of particles or different size classes, or they use different phase velocities in the methodological research. And it's pretty hard to just sort of say a 90% effectiveness in fabric from one study is equivalent to a 90% effectiveness in fabric filtration performance in another. So that's a challenge, again, due to lack of standardization. Many characterization papers tend to have what I call haphazard selection of materials for testing. So instead of having a systematic investigation of one material type and really being able to relate its properties, they're sort of grabbing fabrics from all different sources. Sometimes the descriptions of what fabrics are used are not well articulated in the publications. So it's difficult for other researchers to retest those fabrics. And more importantly, it may be difficult for sewists to go out, source, locate, and purchase those fabrics to make their own homemade masks. And then again, so that third point is already covered. So another thing that we tended to notice is, at least in the material and filtration studies, there's very little regard to whether or not the mask is actually suitable or the material is suitable for constructing a mask out of. So a lot of people early in the pandemic were talking about, oh yeah, just use a vacuum bag. Well, aside from the hazardous materials associated with vacuum bags, the fact that at least a couple of vacuum bag manufacturers explicitly started writing on their labels, do not use this for making a mask. They're not very good to sew with. They're stiff. Even Vandersand remarked that they're probably not suitable for constructing a mask out of. Again, not a lot of systematic studies of a large number of testing of a single fabric type. Some limited, but still insufficient research on the effectiveness of cloth mask fitting features. This is something that we're going to dwell on in our talk, and some but limited research on RCTs and other epidemiological research focusing on cloth mask interventions. So it took me a while to get into the main part of this study and our objective, but it was really to really look at two-ply cloth mask, very simple design, simple materials, and assess different cottons that are locally and commercially available to construct masks out of. And we had 3 different hypotheses to test that fabrics that were purchased from what we'll call the same consumer category, meant for the same application, whether it be something like tea towels used for drying your dishes, or whether it be t-shirts, or whether that be quilting cottons. That we figured that maybe fabrics from the same type of use category would have similar characteristics. Fabrics with larger pore sizes and looser weaves were expected to produce masks with poorer performance. And we were hoping that at least some types of cotton fabrics would start to approach that of the modern medical masks in their performance. So why would we use cottons? Really the reason for choosing cottons is that they are the most globally produced type of textile in the world. And they're widely available as consumer goods. So WESUP had conducted some initial surveys of available materials across the Windsor-Essex commercial base, and then they were looking at things that they could buy from brick and mortar stores as opposed to having to order online. And cotton's by far were the most available compared to synthetics and other materials. They're easy to sew with, they're heat resistant, they can be ironed, and being able to iron helps in the mass construction process quite a bit, robust to multiple washings. Cottons are used for use at least in one or more layers in mass cloth masks by Health Canada, World Health Organization, and CDC. But we do know that they vary in their filtration performance, so careful selection of the cotton that you choose is important. So in this research, we tested 52 cotton masks, and to our knowledge, this is the most comprehensive testing of one type of fabric in terms of the magnitude of materials tested. And then we basically placed these into 9 consumer categories: bandana, t-shirts, fashion fabrics, various quilting cotton grades, tea towel, bed sheets, home decor, and we had multiple samples. And we tried to source these samples in a way that we're collecting samples from multiple retail outlets, or in the cases of some of the high quality quilting cottons, for example, there was only so many sources we could get them from. So we made sure that we diversified the brands and manufacturing sources of the samples that we get. Okay, so we have multiple research elements, and I'm going to kind of describe them in each bullet point and their results. So the first step was material characterization by scanning electron microscopy. This was just to determine the characteristics of the materials, such as the pore size, the density of the weave, the thread counts, and so forth. Then we constructed 2-ply masks out of our worst and best performers and a bunch of masks in between, so for 16 of those masks. And then we subjected them to quantitative fit testing to see in the same mask design how different materials varied in their performance. We developed a model to predict the fitted filtration efficiency of masks based on the material characteristics from electron microscopy. And with that model, we were then able to predict how all 52 masks should theoretically perform when used in our standard 2-ply cloth mask design. So in terms of the electron microscopy characterization, we basically cut out 1-inch squares of each fabric type, and then we characterized them with the electron scanning and electron microscope at Gleer at the University of Windsor. And again, a whole bunch of different series of measurements. The main ones that became really important were the pore size dimensions, the mean pore diameters. So we could see 2 distinctly different fabrics here, and those pores are highlighted by the orange here. And with the digitization software, you can come up with a whole bunch of different parameters, what the mean diameter of this pore is, what its perimeter size is, what its total area was. So there's a whole bunch of metrics. We also measured the fabric weight, which is just the grams per square meter of material. And this kind of gives you a perspective of our worst performing cotton. These are all under the same degree of magnification. I think it's a 42-time magnification versus our best or least smallest pore size material. This was a bed sheet where you can see the weave is really tight. You can see the weave is different from a sort of a standard normal weave. This one has complexity in the weave style. Most of them were of a plain weave, just across in the vertical and horizontal directions of the threads. But clearly we see very large differences in pore gaps. The bottom here pictures represent the inner, the outer, and the middle layer of a medical mask. And you can see very, very different structure of the medical non-woven materials compared to the 2-ply cottons. And here we see that there's a vastly larger difference in the pore sizes between the outer inner layer versus the middle layer, which is the filtration layer of a medical fabric. So that mean middle layer had a pore diameter of 20 microns. And we only had one fabric that approached that, which was a high thread count bed sheet. at about 40 microns in size. So now when we sort of categorized all of our fabrics into pore size, we see distinct differences. So small pore size is good, large pore size is bad. Our worst performers were bandana, followed by T-towel and T-shirts. So we expected these fabrics to do better, these fabrics to do worse. And as any good research, sometimes the research doesn't quite match what you thought it would be, and we'll discover that in a moment. This is a multivariate analysis, an ordination taking all of our different mass characteristics and compressing it into two-dimensional space. But you don't really have to know about multivariate analysis, but what it does try to show is whether or not materials from the same category are distinctly different or not, testing that second hypothesis in our research. So where we see the same colored symbols are masks of one material. So where I'm highlighting here are bandanas, and you see that all the bandanas fall in a distinct cluster marked by this sort of shaded triangle area, and it's distinct from all of the other fabrics. And then we have some separation, but common overlap of T-shirts and T-towels. And then we have all our sort of quilting fabrics and bed sheets on this axis. So from the material characteristic properties, we sort of have quilting materials, bed sheets that are falling on this side of the ordination, bandana being in its own distinct case, and then some commonalities largely due to high fabric weight for T-shirts, T-towels, and home decor fabrics. Okay, so once we did the characterization of materials, then we had to create masks. WESEF led an entire process of trying to figure out what are the types of materials to use, what are the types of patterns to develop, and then that ultimately led to a professional panel review where prototype masks of 4 different designs were sent to local experts for them to rate and rank. Now, this wasn't direct fit testing, but it was at least trying to get early in this process when we couldn't arrange the fit testing yet, to get some experts to look at these different masks and give us their opinion, use their life experience to tell us what they thought were good designs, what probably had good performance. And these local experts consisted of occupational health officers from 2 institutions, nurses and physicians from 2 hospitals. And again, we had everyone rate each of these masks based on a scoring sheet. And these are sort of pictures of the 4 masks that they were given. We ultimately, the panel review selected 2 masks, which WESEF adopted as its standard mask, the Essex pleated mask design and the Windsor hybrid mask. And then ultimately we chose one of these, the Essex pleated, just because it was easier to sew. And it's what WESEF was constructing for the most part and distributing. So, they distributed about 60,000 products, but of those, we estimate about 50,000 of those products were Essex pleated masks given out to the local community, healthcare workers, and vulnerable groups in need. So the 18 masks that we ended up constructing Essex pleated consisted of our fabric with the largest pore diameter, one of the bandanas, with the smallest pore diameter, that bed sheet, and then another 14 fabrics that were sort of in between those, collected at random. So with these 16 masks in hand, we did some quantitative fit testing. Initially, we got some results from a local company in Windsor, Second Chance CPR, who gave us in-kind donation of their resources and time, and we thank them so much for that. And then we ended up moving to collaborate with McMaster University, who had a little bit more high resolution infrastructure to give us better distinctive characteristics in our fit factors to a single decimal place level. So this fit testing apparatus is a porter count fit tester and a sodium chloride aerosol generator that produces aerosol particles with a median diameter of 0.05 micron. The reason why they use particles in this size range is that they're considered the most permeating particle sizes. They're the most difficult for especially cloth masks to filter out. And the way this operates is the mask wearer, here's some handsome guy who's acting as the tester right now. But they wear a mask and they have to destroy the mask when you do the fit testing. So they insert a probe, brass probe through the material that's riveted in place. Then one of the inlet for the mask, the air from the interior of the mask goes to the particle counter. And then there's a second probe that's located just outside the mask. And that's able to contrast the difference in particle concentration, interior and exterior to the mask. And of course, there is a particle generator just located right in front of the camera in this shot that's producing a set concentration of particles in the room. Okay, so the meat of the result. Okay, let's, we have on our x-axis, y-axis, the fitted filtration efficiency. So this is what fraction of those particles were blocked by the mask based on the difference in the mask interior versus the exterior. You know, and then 95 is supposed to produce a theoretical value of 95%. And the theoretical value of the surgical mask should hit along this green line. It didn't. So where the surgical mask actually tended to land was at this line. This is for me as a tester. It was about 55, it was close to 55%, a little bit under that. The blue dots here represent our 16 homemade masks measured in triplicate. And to our surprise, we wanted to have one or two of our high-performing masks start to approach that red line. Most of them did just as good as the surgical mask. So this was very surprising to us, pleasantly surprising, but surprising to us. There was only the set of masks that were made out of bandana that did underperform compared to the medical mask. You know, so they were getting an average of about 40 to 45%. When we compared mask performance against the material pore diameter, there was a negative relationship as expected with some weird things, you know, so these materials did not fit in line. I can tell you right now, this is tea towels. So tea towels did not fit the expected performance relative to pore size. Those tea towels had the second highest pore size across the fabrics tested. And, but when we also contrasted mask filtration efficiency against the fabric weight, then fabric weight had, you know, thicker fabrics had better performance potential. So that's what's happening with this cluster, which is t-shirts, or maybe it's home decor fabrics. And this one is tea towels, is that they have these high fabric weights that offset the larger pore size. So we then done a bunch of model optimization with multiple regression models. I won't go through the model fitting process, but essentially we're trying to generate a goodness of fit test where the, you know, we have on the y-axis the measured mask fitted filtration efficiency versus what we predict with our model. And if we had a perfect model, every one of these dots would fit on this dashed line that represents the perfect one-to-one fit. And you can see that there's some variability. For some masks, we underpredict, some masks, we overpredict the performance. But by and large, they tend to fall along that line, which tells us that the model was a good performance. In fact, we're able to explain 81% of the variability in the data by taking into consideration two terms, what the pore size is and what the fabric weight is. We then use that model to extrapolate across all our 52 characterized cotton fabrics what the theoretical performance of a 2-ply cotton mask made from those 52 materials would be. And again, the dashed red lines sort of represent the minimum and maximum, the confidence interval ranges of the medical mask performance. And we can see most materials across all consumer categories are falling within that, with some actually exceeding the expected medical mask performance. The only one were the bandanas, which basically underperformed compared to a medical mask. Okay. The question is one, why did the surgical mask only operate at around 50% when it's supposed to operate at about 90%? And the flaw in just using a fitted filtration test as is that it integrates both the filtration performance of your mask, but also if you have leaks in your mask. So we're all used to seeing gaps around the side of the cheeks, and hopefully people don't wear their mask with their nose sticking out of it. But these gaps basically let air into the interior, and that air that leaks into a mask is 100% unfiltered air. And we can get around this by using a device called a mask fitter. So there's a number of commercial devices. They look like a sort of a siliconized, almost like a scuba mask material that fits that mask very tightly to your face, and it prevents leaks out of the sides and under the chin and over top of the nose. We used a commercial product called Fix the Mask, available by internet sourcing. And basically, if you use a mask fitter, now there's no more leaks. So you should get a mask performance that better fits its theoretical filtration efficiency. Now, when we compare our mask performance, we had two different testers, and there were slightly different results between the two testers. For whatever reason, when I wear a mask, it fits me better than when Amanda, my other participant, wears a mask. It tends to fit her a little bit worse for wear. But the big thing here is when you put that mask fitter on, all of a sudden the surgical mask shoots up its performance to about 90%, very close to its theoretical operating potential. But when you put a mask fitter on our cotton mask, it didn't really change the performance. So essentially, we're able to assign how much leakage is occurring in these different masks. So almost 50% of the air entering that surgical mask is coming from leaks. And in our cloth mask, it was only about 3.7%. So that's really important to understand why we're doing just about as good as the medical mask. And then we have to ask the question, well, why did these WESET masks do so well? Well, one reason is we weren't using the common elastic ear loop design. We were using ties in our masks. In the particular WESET mask, Essex pleated design and their hybrid design, there's these open channels that you could basically switch out elastics or ties to. But when you use them with ties, or if you have very tight elastic fits, you have this sort of free floating strap in the channel, and that self-tightens, and it basically reduces the gaps at your cheeks and under your chin and nose. So they're very effective at mask fitting. In contrast, the medical masks, most of them use these really weak elastic bands for elastic ear loops, and they just simply don't hold the mask as tight to your face. There are some hacks you can use, like the knot and tuck technique, that help improve performance, but most people, I don't think, use that technique just based on a visual scan of how people wear surgical masks. One might ask the question, well, a lot of WESET masks, most people use cloth masks with an elastic ear loop. Is their performance as bad as the medical mask? And to our surprise, it was sort of no, it was a worser performance. So you see the difference in performance dropping when we used the Essex pleated with elastic ear loops. But there's still only about an 11% leakage. And we think that's, again, because of the thicker elastics that are a little bit tighter to the ears that are used and distributed as standard augments in the mask design itself. So to generate some conclusions in terms of hypothesis, one, we thought that fabrics from one type of consumer category would have similar characteristics. And that seemed to be the case, although we were able to lump a whole bunch of different fabrics together. And certainly the worst performing fabric, those of cotton bandanas, stood on its own. So don't make your masks out of cotton bandanas. We then fit tested those masks, and again, we found that our worst performing mask, the bandana, also, or material, the bandana with high pore sizes, produced not a very good mask. But we found that almost every other material tested was capable of producing a medical mask with performance similar to the medical one. So mask fitters demonstrated that our high performance of the cottons relative to the medical mask wasn't due to its superior filtration efficiency, but rather how well that mask fit the face. And of course, we've demonstrated that you can vastly improve a medical mask by using a mask fitter instead of using the ear loops. And you can also buy medical masks with ties that tend to perform closer to about 70 to 75% filtration efficiency according to the literature. Again, if we look at larger particle sizes greater than 1 micron, because medical masks are letting 50% of the air unfiltered in, this means that the cotton masks, because they only have about 3% leakage, they're going to be better for those blocking out larger droplets in coughing and sneezing. And again, there's some decline in the performance of cotton masks when you use ear loops instead of ties. So why is this all important? Well, we have a number of Western Europe jurisdictions that are moving to ban cloth masks in public places and require the public to use medical masks. And I'm going to suggest that it's in all likelihood, most of those public are going to use disposable surgical masks with those ear loops, and they're actually going to be having a worse performance than a good fitting cloth mask, not a better mask. So it is a bit counteractive to that policy movement. The actions would be justified if they required people to wear medical masks with mask fitters or wear medical masks that are tied behind the head instead of ear loops. But I think it is problematic that basically these policies are based on misguided research finding interpretations. And then I also want to indicate, these were basic masks. Most World Health Organization, CDC, Health Canada, they all recommend at least a 3-ply mask. These were just 2-ply masks, still performing as well as a medical mask. The same cotton, because that was part of the goal, is it was the same cotton in both the interior and the exterior. But the modern masks recommend a 3-ply design and a mixture of fabrics that include a synthetic polyester face fabric and maybe a cotton interior fabric that combine sort of hydrophobic and hydrophilic properties. And then, of course, one has to note and again caution that just because you found the latest and greatest exotic material to make your mask out of, don't make the assumption that it's a superior mask. You really need the empirical data and the testing to back that up, because sometimes you can have a great mask, but if it doesn't conform to the face well and you can't get a good fit, it's not going to be a good performing mask. And my take-home message is we really should be focusing our efforts towards mask compliance, adherence to those multiple safety barriers, not just reliant on the mask, and educating people about how important it is to make sure your mask fits well. Okay, now we've been getting a lot of press play in 2 weeks because of the release of this preprint about the Bangladesh study, the first randomized controlled trial. And a lot of the press has sort of taken this as sort of evidence implicit that cloth masks don't work and surgical masks do. And before we go there, let's take the quotes at face value from the authors themselves, from Albaluk. And they found that while cloth masks clearly reduce symptoms, they cannot reject the idea that unlike surgical masks, they may have only a small effect on symptomatic coronavirus infections. So it sounds bad, but you'll notice that there's a bunch of wiggle words. And the second quote is something that we should highlight from the lead author of that paper. The research did not produce evidence that cloth masks are ineffective. The results don't necessarily show that surgical masks are much better than cloth masks, but we find much clear evidence of the effectiveness in surgical masks. Now, there's some wiggle words in there, and there's a reason for that. I was a little bit worried when I discovered this preprint and read through it. I took a fairly close read. And those interpretations by the press I'm going to suggest are a little bit misleading, at least because this was a true, valid randomized controlled trial. It demonstrates very conclusively that incentivizing mask use impacts how many people actually mask compliance in the population. But the actual trial and its design wasn't really developed with a statistical rigor to test cloth versus surgical masks. In fact, they had different controls, and they were comparing cloth mask relative to a cloth mask control, surgical mask versus a surgical mask control. And even though this RCT had 330,000 individuals that are participants, it turns out that only 74 people actually developed the antibodies in their blood, signifying that they had a COVID-19 infection. Those 74 individuals were split between 4 groups. And when you work those treatment numbers down, it was between 2 to 3 fewer individuals in the surgical mask group compared to its control that had infectious antibodies in their blood, and 1 to 2 individuals. So we're talking about the difference of 1 person. There was also twice as many individuals disseminated surgical masks versus cotton masks. So there's a lot of problems about the statistical power and the inferences you can really make about whether or not cloth masks don't work as effectively, because it is sort of an unfair comparison in that respect. Unfortunately, the press has sort of taken this adage that the paper somehow means they shouldn't wear cloth masks, and I don't think that's a valid conclusion. So I kind of leave this at the end with my appeal to you. How about time went on? So maybe some of you out there already have a WESEF mask in your possession. And if you do, most likely it uses elastic ear loops. I hope you get inspired to try the tie approach. Try fitting it out with some shoelaces or the WESEF sponsored generated ties that are out there. Give it a shot. It's not that bad. And this could boost your mask efficiency by as much as 8%. Or maybe you have a cotton mask that could be modified with free-flowing channels and you can outfit with the ties. But I want you to consider this a little bit of a challenge. Also be very conscious about how well does your mask really fit. So does your mask bellow in and out when you're breathing in and out? Can someone see that? Or can you look in the mirror and see that your mask responds to your breath? If it's not, it's probably leaking. Do your glasses fog? Are there noticeable gaps at the cheeks or under your chin and above your nose? And then maybe if you really want to up your grade with a surgical mask, maybe you can use a tied WESEF mask over top of it. Guaranteed to increase your fit, or purchase a mask, a fitter. And again, one of the little hacks, one thing that I found as soon as Philippa had showed me this little trick of basically taking your 2 bottom bands in a WESEF mask and tying it in a knot, then you slip that over your head, and then you just have to tie 1 knot instead of tying both. That little hack makes the mask 100% easier to don than it normally does. I personally now prefer a tied mask to an ear loop mask. My ears don't get sore. The mask stays in place. I never had it fall below my nose, and I adjust it every time I tie it to my head. So I know I went a little bit over time. Apologize for that. Academics tend to have a bit of a trouble rambling on sometimes, but I will stop sharing my screen and let Lisa take over.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. That was awesome. I learned a lot, and I hope people online did as well. We have a couple of questions in the chat. So one was, did you review, oh wait, sorry, there was one before this, I think. No, did you review filters at all? I don't know why I couldn't.
Yeah, there's actually 2 publications, and sorry, I don't have the memory that I do that I did in my 20s, but I do have those papers available that looked at filters in masks and their relative performance. And So what those papers recommend and what they indicate is the surface area of the filter is really important. And the best mask filters are ones that are actually integrated as a third middle layer into the mask. So like that surgical mask, where the filter basically covers the entire surface of the mask. What tends to happen is if you have a really good filter in the center of your mask and gaps around that it's surrounded by the other mask material, is all the air just gets pushed out. And sometimes if there's too much of a seal from the filter, that causes you to like sort of with your breath, causes the mask to lift off the face and you get more outward leakage. So filters is a tricky thing. And then the other thing is that you got to make sure that the filter itself, if you insert something in there, it doesn't conform the mask, so it produces more gaps. So you have to be very cautious about filters. And of course, that also begs the question of what is the filter that you're adding, and hopefully it's something that isn't hazardous.
Exactly. And so Patty asks, well, the channels on the fabric masks dramatically improve a tighter fit. How do the nose wires help with nose fit? Did you look at that?
Oh, was that Patty Savage?
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. It's just Patty in the chat.
I was going to say Patty probably knows better than I do because she was involved in constructing so many masks. I think that's going to vary by facial features. There was a decision early on by the WESEP leadership team, and this is in consultation with the hospitals. And of course, the original mission was to distribute masks to healthcare workers. And there were some concerns that inserting wires in a mask that was intended to go through laundering and reuse operations, that you can get the wire bursting through the fabric and generating an eye injury. So there was a lot of concerns about that, and there was actually some reported incidents in confidence that happened in places in Ontario. So that was sort of removed out of the mask design. But again, it's going to vary by people and their facial features. Maybe I have a flat enough nose, but I'm getting 90% or 97% sealage just with the ties and no nose wire. So if you don't need it, you don't need it.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Sarah had some good points here and some comments. It's concerning that the hospitals and educational institutions are requiring disposable surgical masks over cloth.
Yeah, so when you enter a hospital, and again, you have to sort of think about their security and control procedures when they're coming into place. And the reality is they're just as worried as somebody coming in with this ultra dirty mask that has never been washed and they don't know what the quality is. So I think even if you come into the hospital, maybe I'm wrong, but certainly my wife Rebecca has told me about this. Even if you come in with a surgical mask in place, which they approve, they give you a new one and say, please place this new mask on, just because they're ensuring their own quality control standards when you enter their facility.
Yeah, the same was true for the mass vaccination centers, a lot of them. Then she also said the idea of the mask fitters with the disposables when you don't have a choice of which mask to wear is helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, these things cost about $20 online. I'll send Lisa some of the links for some of the mask fitter sources if she wants to direct them to the group.
Yeah, lots of compliments, lots of thanks. And Rebecca sends her thanks to the Windsor Essex Sewing Force volunteers who are on the line, who sewed thousands of masks. And she also thanks Ken and the other scientists who helped achieve the goals of making masks based on emerging science, which I agree was so needed. So it's an excellent study.
Well, Rebecca's my partner and spouse, by the way, and one of the co-founders of WESEP. And husbands don't always get compliments from their spouses, so I'll take that one.
That's a good. Um, and so Mary comments, the environmental concern with disposable masks is also that folks do not tear the loops. Oh yeah, before disposing them. That's dangerous to wildlife. I never even thought of that actually.
Yeah, it's kind of like the pop can or the six-pack plastic analogy, right? As a strangulation thread. Good point.
Yeah, exactly. And then another question, when you did your testing, were the fabrics consistent within each category, or did some categories have more variability?
That is a very good question. Yeah, so we found, for example, the tea towel category was really variable. You can get some tea towels that are just of a plain weave, some have a complex weave, some have a terry cloth finish. They varied in their fabric thicknesses. So it wasn't guaranteed just because you buy a tea towel that it would perform as good as the best ones. One of the reasons why WESEF was convinced on using a high quality quilting cotton is that it demonstrated the smallest degree of variation. So even across the different brands in which it was purchased, those masks all and those fabrics all seem to perform identically.
There's a question about breathability. So when talking about breathability, I know people who have issues with their masks and need a lot of airflow, so they don't have trouble with it. What would you recommend for them?
Well, we didn't really test breathability. It's, these are things that, we've all kind of come to grips with 18 months of wearing masks of different types. One of the things that surprised me about the testing when I did the testing with the mask fitter over top of that surgical mask is you normally put on a surgical mask and it seems really breathable. That's because half of the air is coming in through the gaps. When I put that mask fitter on, all of a sudden the breathability was quite noticeably different. And that might be a benefit of something like a simple 2-ply cotton mask. You're not going to get any better performance with a mask fitter, but it does have high breathability. The sacrifices it has lower filtration efficiency, but about the same effectiveness as a medical mask without the fitter.
Cool. There's a few comments about like skin reactions with different masks.
Mm-hmm. Let's hear it.
Yeah. Well, Devinder says that like getting skin reaction to mask acne is bad with certain materials, but prefers cotton masks. And somebody asked about, do you know if there's studies on allergies to different materials or to the surgical masks?
I've scoured the mask literature to my best of ability, and I haven't seen anything about dermal infections. I think my wife Rebecca can come on and relay her sort of chats with the dermatologists that she's had in informal conversations, but I haven't seen anything formally published in the literature.
I guess what I can speak to is that we did have a number of requests from dermatology offices, and I can't name them due to confidentiality, and also family doctor offices, specifically for kids, not just kids, but kids and adults with skin problems. So I don't know if that was based on research or incidental findings. I would say talk to your doctor, maybe share the link to this talk so they have a better understanding of the effectiveness of cloth masks. I know one of the challenges has been that without a lot of research on cloth masks, it's hard to get widespread endorsement. So I'm hoping if this paper is published, it can help advance masks where cloth are needed for specific purposes and for accessibility to all.
Great. So thank you so much. There's lots of comments, lots of thanks in the chat. So lots of people found it really helpful. So I'm sure that the video, people can also circulate it to your friends and family so they can learn a little bit more about the science that's being done right here in Windsor, Essex, to support cloth masks. And with that, I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank you, Ken, for an amazing talk. Rebecca and all the Windsor Essex Sewing Force volunteers, thank you so much for all your hard work in protecting all of our front lines during COVID. You did an amazing job. So thank you on behalf of everybody at WeSpark.
Yeah, let me reiterate that thanks to those WeSF community volunteers. I mean, you guys rose to the occasion. You are our unsung heroes in this healthcare crisis. Thank you so much.